the things we do today in this space impact many years in the future. So you have to be patient, consistent, and committed. At the same time, you have to bring urgent energy to drive this. So I'm really appreciative of all of you coming and attending. I also have to make sure that I acknowledge all the hard work of my colleagues. I have 7 pages of prepared comments from them, and so I wanted to acknowledge the hard work of the team, and you'll be delighted to know that I'm going to read every word of the 7 pages over the next hour and 15 minutes, and leave maybe 30 seconds to the panel. But joking aside, I'm not going to do that at all, but if anybody would like to see my prepared remarks, I can make copies and circulate them to you. But please do make sure that when you see my staff, you do say that I acknowledged them, that I read them, that I was completely committed to the content. That slight humor, and some of you have been kind enough to at least smile as I talk through that, so I'm very, very grateful for that. It actually gives me great pleasure to have this panel. The sustainability infrastructure that we talk about here, the development bonds, enormously important to the bank, something we've been committed to since the bank started funding, and something we will remain committed to. It essentially means that it captures the whole of the bank. So many of you will be aware of theme bonds starting back in green bonds, blue bonds, orange bonds, thematic bonds, social bonds, and so on. Carve out components of an institution's commitment to this. The bank very, very early on said very clearly, everything we do, the entirety of our investments are completely committed to sustainability, and therefore the entirety of the funding and our approach to capital markets is driven by the sustainability agenda. So you'll be aware that through the hard work of colleagues, we've now on our 3rd edition of our impact report, and every year that report gets fuller, more detailed, more forensic in addressing the rightful needs of investors in wanting to understand exactly what institutions like AIIB do, institutions like other multilateral development banks, corporates, banks, exactly what is the impact of what we're trying to do? How do we measure it? And through that, driving more behaviors and more commitment and more energy and more projects. I've got 1 minute left because I have to hit my mark of not speaking for longer than 5 minutes. Yue, my colleague, briefed me very, very clearly on this, and she's a hard taskmaster. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome Yulin from PwC. Just as a slight comment, just to declare, PwC is our external auditors. We've had a fantastic relationship with our external auditors, absolutely vital in our business around transparency and openness, but just want to be clear that Yulin is here from PwC Singapore to moderate what is an excellent panel. And then one last shout out, my real thanks to the panelists. You've come a long way. What you have to say is really, really important. You have great depth, great knowledge, great content, and I'm really going to encourage you, Lynn, to make the audience ask you really difficult questions. So with that, Yulin, if I can ask you to come up and take control of the session. Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks so much for inviting me. I come from Singapore. It's a small little dot, red dot in Asia, and I think all of us traveled quite long and far for this panel, so we hope to make it worthwhile for everybody as well. Well, a very good morning to everyone here today and in this beautiful country of Egypt and this stunning city of Sharm El Sheikh as well. It's my first time in Egypt, and definitely I'm being wowed, by the vastness of it and so much of opportunity and also, so much potential of Egypt as well. My name is Yulin, and I head the Sustainability Practice and the Asia Pacific Center for Sustainability Excellence based out of our Singapore office. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this session and these very esteemed panelists as well, which I'm sure will be able to ask you, they're going to be able to answer all your tough questions as well. And today, the session today is called Financing Sustainable Infrastructure with Sustainable Development Bonds. We heard yesterday that the momentum towards creating a low-carbon and sustainable world has been accelerating. For example, the establishment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we are all very familiar with, and other global governance type of alliance platforms, such as the GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which rally financial institutions, including investors, to decarbonize their portfolios. And as they tilt their portfolios, green and sustainable bonds and other instruments can be rather attractive and very useful as well. So companies and financial institutions are re-examining the way that they do business and support more sustainable bonds and loans with a quest of not only to green their portfolio, but to help nations, as we discussed yesterday, reach their sustainable development goals and ambitions as well, which is very important. So it is no surprise that over the past decade, the sustainable-related bonds issuance have surpassed $1 trillion and just over $200 billion in 2018, 5 years ago. There is also notable trajectory in Asia as well, like how my colleagues later will discuss. But can we do more? And certainly, MDBs can play a vital role in this, and even more so against the post-COVID world and difficult market conditions, which we'll discuss a little bit more about later. Based on the Sustainable Development Goals Report 2023, which was released in July of this year, it seems as if that we are making some progress, but then again, it's not enough. Later, Jitin will also comment a little bit more about that. Therefore, a means to an end to accelerate the sustainable development bonds is to accelerate sustainable development bonds. We are actually at the midpoint. And I believe this is called midlife crisis, right? We reflect about what we've done in our first part of our lives. And now in our second part of our lives, or the second part of the journey in terms of our sustainable development goals, what types of decisions are we going to make? We could buy a Ferrari, right, as part of our midlife crisis, or we could do something substantive and meaningful as well. And later on, I'll ask my panelists what they view in the future of sustainable development and also sustainable development bonds and other instruments as well. So today, we are going to talk about AIIB's Sustainable Development Bond Framework and the outlook of sustainable finance in Asia with case studies from the panel and the role of NDBs as market makers for sustainable financing in Asia. But I'd like to just introduce some of my esteemed panel members, firstly, starting from my left-hand side, Mr. Domenico Nadali, who manages AIIB's Treasury Department. Excuse me. I call him the master fundraiser as well for the AIIB. Basically, he's a very important man. And before joining AIIB in September 2019, he was the treasurer of the International Fund for Agricultural Development as well. And prior to that, took on various positions, including investment banking. On my right-hand side, Ibu Dwi Irianti is the Director of Islamic Finance and carries out the formulation and implementation of Sukuk portfolio management policies, SBSN assets management, market intelligence in preparing recommendations for SBSN issuance, and fatwas and Sharia options in SBSN issuance as well. Thank you so much for being here. On the right-hand side, Mr. Rose, Antoine Rose, is the head of Sustainable Investment Banking for Asia Pacific and Middle East at Credit Agricole CIB. He is responsible for developing the bank's sustainable finance footprint and product range in the regions. Welcome, Antoine. And last but not least, Mr. Jitin Wignaraja. And Jitin is the Director of Development Finance and Distribution at JP Morgan, based in London. He's responsible for identifying investors interested in owning development-focused assets and providing support to JP Morgan syndicate and sales teams in attracting these investors to JPM DFI-assessed transactions. He will also be responsible for originating and structuring of new development finance products to further attract institutional investment. A big round of applause to our panel members here. Okay, first up, I want to ask the Italian in the room, Mr. Domenico. AIIB has now released its third Sustainable Development Bond Impact Report, highlighting the bank's contribution to building a more resilient and sustainable future. Please, could you share specific impacts and achievements in AIIB Sustainable Development Bonds supported, and how do you think these experiences continue to drive investor confidence in sustainability bonds generally? Over to you.
Thanks very much, Yulin, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. If I talk about the experience of AIIB, first of all, I want to say that we have been lucky in a way to seize the opportunity of working in a new multilateral development bank. We often say that we use catchy phrases like we finance infrastructure for tomorrow. We pride ourselves to saying that this is the newest MDB to have been created. It is the MDB for the 21st century. What that means is that we had an opportunity to build things from scratch. And as the CFO of the bank just explained very clearly, what we decided was to go straight into just one category as an issuer of bonds. We leveraged the fact that sustainability is clearly mentioned in the Articles of Agreement, which is the basic document establishing the bank. So those provisions say that we finance sustainable infrastructure. And so what we did by putting together the Sustainable Development Bond Framework, we decided to place AIIB in the markets as a sustainable issuer. So again, as the CFO explained, not having different categories of bond issuance from conventional all the way to the various thematic categories, but just build one framework for issuance. Our framework is built around simplicity and is designed to help investors understand what AIIB is about. So simplicity is the key. We built the framework around 4 basic principles, which are completely in line with those of you who follow the capital markets will know. They are in line with the ICMA principle, the International Capital Markets Association. And so they revolve around the use of proceeds, the management of proceeds, the screening of the projects of the bank, and ultimately how we report these results. And if I come to reporting about the impact that the bank is generating, that is really key. Because if you think about global investors and the many asset managers who are looking to deploy their funds with issuers of sustainable bonds, all they want to know is what you are doing, and they want to make sure that their dollars, they reach the intended target. And so from the Sustainable Development Bond Framework, from those sets of principles that we defined in the beginning, we started to produce an impact report. And for a new bank like us, this is no trivial undertaking. I have joined the bank personally in 2019. The bank had been in operation for 3 years only. So everything was not there, to start doing this. The systems, the data collection, but we pushed on, we pressed on, and we decided that this is a good thing to do for the bank, for our investors. And so the result, I have it here. This is the publication that we have. This is the impact report, which the CFO mentioned. We proudly just published the third edition this year, referring to last year, all the projects that we approved last year. I showed you the report. We normally don't print it. It's on the website for those who want to see, talking about sustainability here. But the impact report is basically, it's a big pledge made by the bank. So what we do with the impact report, we started humbly, so producing data for those projects where we did have data. And every year, in the second edition and the third edition, we expanded that. With the third edition, you find the whole list of projects, each and every project that the bank has approved. And I want to be transparent and say that in terms of the impact, we still don't have a lot of data of ex post, so impact generated after implementation. The bank is about financing infrastructure projects. These are complex projects that normally have a long lifespan, and they take 7, 8, even more years to complete. And so what we have right now in the impact report is a set of the expected impact that we are looking to generate. And you find a lot of information there, depending on the sector. It could be a reduction in greenhouse gases, it could be empowering local community, it could be different types. And you will see that over the years, as we put together more and newer editions of the impact report, we are also going to include ex post data after implementation. And this is I think it's the direction that the market and investors want to go, rather than, overcomplicating the framework for issuance with many rules and different approaches at national level. But if you find a common language, and we are probably going to talk about that later, if you find a common language in terms of how to communicate the results that you are achieving with these resources that we are deploying, that's really the way to go.
Domenico, you start off with the word called simplicity, but I don't really think it's that simple. By the way, I've seen your impact report. It's also rather thick. So actually, I think what you're saying is that we can start off simple, but make no doubt that impact and trying to achieve sustainability goals is quite complex. But we build on it step by step, year on year. And also start with basic principles. You mentioned the ICMA principles. I think that's a very well-established global set of principles that we can all start with. I know we're going to unpack a little bit more about what impact measurement means a little bit later, but thank you so much, and I love what you said about staying humble, but making a good start based on good principles, and then, carry on with that journey on that. Thank you so much, Domenico. And if I may now go to my right, to ask Ibu, because Ibu, I also read your impact report, okay? So for Indonesia, and also quite thick also, yeah? So I want to ask you about Indonesia's green sukuk issuances. Now, you've been deeply involved with that. I wanted to ask you whether you can share the experience of Republic of Indonesia's green sukuk issuance, and specifically for Indonesia, what is your perspectives of Islamic finance potential to achieve sustainable development as well? Ibu, please, if you can share. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I would like to thanks to AIIB for having me here. because this is also the first time for me to visit Egypt, and the first time for me to speak on the AIIB event. Well, for suku, green suku, I think before I share about the success story of green suku of Indonesia, allow me to briefly tell about the historical background why government of Indonesia issue green suku. And actually we have a choice whether we issue in green suku format or in green bond format. For the first reason, the background is Indonesia is extremely vulnerable to climate change. As we see that more than 80% of disaster are hydrometeorological in origins. And our goal that the government has a strong commitment to limiting the effects of climate change. We ratified the Paris Agreement in 2016, as well as we submitting our NDC for 2030. And so that's why green suku actually is part of our commitment to combat the climate change. The second things why green suku is not green bond. Actually, we see that the format of green and format of suku, it's very similar, where both of formats needs projects to be funded. For green format, we need projects to be utilized as underlying asset to comply with Islamic principles. And for green format, we need a project to be funded to meet the green standard, which is 100% of our, for our issuance proceeds should be utilized to finance the green projects. So that's why we choose, or we decided to issue green suku rather than green bonds. And we know Indonesia already issue in global market for green suku since 2018 with total issuance of $5 billion. We issue frequently every year, but not this year yet because we still have a lot of money. And also we issue in domestic market with green retail suku since 2019 with total issuance of 25 trillion IDR, so equivalent of 1.7 billion. And recently we also issue for wholesale green suku through auctions. Today we just do auctions because we do auction twice a month. And for green suku we issue once a month. And for the total issuance for the wholesale green suku reached 19.4 trillion IDR, so equivalent about 1.3 billion IDR. For green suku, we need to have to build what we call green framework. And our green framework already established in 2018 and already amended in 2021 to be able to issue not only in green format, but we issue also for blue and SDGs. But for SDGs and blue, we still issue in bond format. For SDGs in 2021 is in euro currency, and for blue, just currently this year we issue in samurai bond. For the green framework, one of our obligation as green issuer, we have to provide what we call green impact report. That one is the most challenging for issuer to have a report. because the report is not only just a report, but we have to measure one by one all the projects that selected to be underlying as for SUCO. So what we have published every year annually since 2019. So it means already 5 times we publish our report, and all report are audited report. And who should audit our report is independent auditors. So far we have KPMG, PwC, and EY. I think that's important things to make sure and to be transparent with the investor. And by having that report, we see more and more participate from the investor in our green SUCO. Because before we issue green SUCO, the demand of our SUCO is not as big as now. Also, in terms of yield, the investor asks more yield before we issue green SUCO. But after we issue green SUCO, we see that the yield will decrease because of more and more demand on that. For example, for the first green SUCO, we issue only 650 million for green and 5 tenor, and now we already issue 3.25 BU just once issuance in 2020, and we have also the longer tenor with 30 years tenor. That's showing the appreciate from investor to issuer who issue in green SUCO. For the green retail SUCO, that it was interesting to take a note that the retail green SUCO successfully attracted millennial investor. So more than 50% of our green retail SUCO are millennial participants. We can compare with now we have almost 800,000 individual investor. I think the bigger participant from millennial is along the current trend of rising green lifestyle among younger generation, and it is demonstrating that the positive impact where the younger generation have increased their awareness of on the environment. So I think the increasing of the investment of green SUCO will support the sustainable development. For the second questions, our view on Islamic finance potential to achieve sustainable development. I think Islamic finance is indeed sustainable finance, since it's supported by legitimate transactions, not speculative instruments, and is linked with Islamic principle where avoid harm to mankind, society, and the environment. And the concept of Islamic finance are also in line with the objective of SDGs framework and also SRI framework or SRI framework and ethical finance framework. We see the demand for SUCO as convergence of Islamic and ESG in the capital markets continues to increase from year to year. In our case, we issue, as I mentioned, there is an increase of a number. So total our SUCO issuance within 15 years reached more than 2,500 trillion IDR, or equivalent with 160 billion US dollar. So I believe Islamic finance has a big potential demand, which could be further mobilized to achieve sustainable development around the world.
Okay, thanks so much, Ibu, for the very comprehensive views on Islamic finance as well. So what I'm hearing from you, Ibu, is that the idea is that actually Islamic finance is very intertwined with sustainable finance as well. And I'm hearing a lot about that, from various quarters, in terms of the characteristics is very similar, and that's your view as well. I thought it was very interesting that you said that the millennials are the one that have a high demand, for the green sukuks. Very, very interesting, and that generally more and more demand for green sukuks, right? And I like the point that what you said as well, which really links up to what Domenico said just now, is that the impact report, whilst it's very, very important, is actually quite difficult to do, right? Especially if you have so many projects that you have actually dispersed your proceeds to, right, in all forms. And I think the other area that you mentioned was about verification, whilst, does take a little bit of effort, does actually help to build trust in the market for this, which goes back to the point, of what Domenico said as well just now, is that, we having that kind of strong impact report, whilst difficult to do, the verification will help, build investor confidence in such instruments as well, right? Which is actually very important. Now, I'm going to now go into a little bit more about Asia, and I wanted to, talk a little bit more about the market for financing, for sustainable financing in Asia, and I'd love to hear views from Mr. Rose, Mr. Antoine over here, Jitin, and then maybe Ibu Dwi, you can chime in as well, don't mind. Okay, you chime in. So, and Antoine, tell me a little bit more about what you see as trends in the Asia's capital market as it relates to sustainable financing, right? And what are the levers that we can actually use to develop stronger and more inclusive market to help the transition of many countries navigating through sustainable development goals, objectives, and of course, the 1.5 Paris Agreement as well. I know that's a lot of words, but just wanted to get your views on that. And you cannot repeat what other people have said, so new views, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. Quite broad. Not sure if I will treat all the points, but so good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. So indeed, I would try.
By the way, Antoine came in very late at night, so this man is a champ, all right? He's still awake.
Okay. Now, so yeah, as in charge of sustainable finance for CREDAG for APAC and Middle East, I'm based in Hong Kong. So yeah, I travel from Hong Kong. A long journey to be there, but quite happy. So indeed, I will try to bring another point of view on the market and insist on some fact. As a bank, we are familiar with the two programs that has been described. Crédit Agricole has been a ESG advisor for AIIB when they launched this program, and we work as also a sustainability advisor for Republic of Indonesia on the SDG and the green. The first comment is Sustainable Development Bond or SDG bond is not a very frequent product. Is not the dominating label in Asia. I mean globally, but even in Asia. In Asia, it's as globally. It's still dominated by green, but there is in Asia the trend or the willingness to bring innovation all the time. So sometimes it's not necessarily strong innovation. It can be seen as quite cosmetic, but you see social sustainability, blue, gender equality, social SMEs, COVID bond, resilience bond, energy transition, carbon neutral bond, biodiversity bond, maybe forest bond. I mean, so that's quite one of the trends. And unfortunately, to answer and bring another view from Domenico's comment, I don't see the market going towards simplicity, unfortunately. Mainly because now we are in the phase in Asia where the governments are following the approach developed in Europe to regulate this market. To regulate in a sense to, first, to raise or to increase the trust of investors in this market. Second, to bring an official definition of what is green and what is sustainable. And by that, they are putting on paper rules. And fair to say that in Asia, you have a huge diversity in terms of situation vis-à-vis the energy transition. And energy transition in particular, the way Japan, Korea, or Indonesia will look at would be different. So as a consequence, the taxonomy would be different. The definition of what is green or what is expected by the local issuers would provide answers that would be different, so for investors or for the market in general. The question of what is green is somehow quite complex, and it will continue that way. As an example, it's quite dynamic. In Asia, Hong Kong, for instance, or Korea or Indonesia, develop sustainable finance markets by putting debt in the market. This year, for instance, just Singapore and India came with their first green, based on their own criteria. And in the next months, we are waiting for Japan to come with maybe the first transition sovereign bond issued from Asia. Australia also announced their willingness to come to green. Could be a different angle. And if I include Middle East also in my scope, I personally work on the Egypt green bond a couple of years ago, and now, with the COP last year in Egypt and the COP in the UAE coming this year, I'm waiting for new announcement from other sovereigns to come with also their vision and their own framework. I will maybe stop here. I know that the question is definitely broader than that, but happy to have an open discussion.
Well done to somebody who's not slept for a long time. Well done. I think what I'm hearing is, may not be so straightforward because definitions of what's green and sustainable differ as well from country to country, and we need that kind of like an interoperability between those taxonomies as well. I know Indonesia got one taxonomy also. Your minister said so yesterday. Yeah, we can talk about that later. But Jitin, you wanted to chime in here?
Yes. Look, thanks first of all to AIIB for giving me the opportunity to speak at this panel and share my thoughts on these interesting topics. Also want to acknowledge the other panelists for the work that they do in their respective fields for sustainability. So I think there's three trends I want to talk about. The first is the obvious headwind the market's facing. The second is more supportive to ESG in Asia. And the third is really to set Asian infrastructure in the context of global developments. So on the first, and I'm borrowing AIIB's poster that you might have seen around the convention, but the slogan there is sustainable growth in a challenging world. And I think it's worth acknowledging that investors have been through a protracted period of risk off, and they faced a set of unprecedented events. So first you had the pandemic, then obviously the subsequent conflicts, and then that pushed food and energy insecurity. Rising inflation has led to higher interest rates, and in Asia you've had some sovereigns default and general concerns about debt distress. So if you're an infrastructure investor and you're looking at emerging markets, it's a tough time, and I think it's worth acknowledging that at the outset. And I appreciate this point was made also during yesterday's panels. But on a more positive note, and I think this is very symptomatic of how ESG is growing in Asia, if you look at 2022 and fund flows, there were big outflows from conventional funds, looking at emerging markets on the back of the concerns that I just mentioned. But sustainable funds actually saw inflows. And if you focus in on Asia, it's even more encouraging. So the proportion of ESG labeled debt pre-2020 was on average about 8%. That now has risen to consistently about 30%. So there's definite interest from issuers and investors on ESG thematic bonds. And within that, in Asia, energy transition is obviously one of the big focus areas, specifically coal phase out. And I'm quoting GFAN's report here, but there are 5,000 active coal plants in Asia, which generate about 60% of the electricity of the region. And that's going to increase in terms of demand for electricity and energy. So there's going to be a huge focus on decommissioning and early phase out of these plants. A lot of those, the majority, are only 10 to 15 years through their life cycle. And that has to be done in a very sensitive fashion because obviously there's a lot of social impact there as well. And then the last point is just to set Asia within the context of global development. So, as everyone knows, in the US, you've had the Inflation Reduction Act. In Europe, you have the Green Deal. And these are great, climate positive, but they just mean that there'll be a surfeit of infrastructure opportunities. So if you're an infrastructure investor, you suddenly have a lot that you can choose from. And rightly or wrongly, investors sometimes look at developed market opportunities as less risky. So I think the Asian market will have to contend with that as well. On the second part of your question, how to develop a stronger and more inclusive market. So I agree that climate is definitely the #1 priority, but in my work, we have to spend a lot of time with investors, especially those in developed markets, explaining that, to fuel growth and prosperity in Asia and generally in emerging markets, you need to invest in basic infrastructure. So roads, ports, railways, hospitals, schools, etc. And there's a huge amount of capital that's ready to be deployed for good purposes. So according to the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, there's $32 trillion in ESG capital, but that can't be deployed only to green, pure play. And so here's where I think the SDGs are super helpful, because they're 17 cross-cutting themes, which give investors the access to investing across the spectrum of development, and they know that they're doing that in a way that's compatible with climate. And I want to use 2 SDGs to illustrate the point about how they can show investors relative value. So SDG 4 on quality education and SDG 13 on climate action. It's interesting, if you look at Vietnam and Cambodia, one has reached their climate target already and one has reached their education target. So if you're an investor who's running a climate strategy or an education strategy, you can clearly see where your investment would have the most impact. A couple of other things to say. As Yulin, you mentioned before, the SDGs can really show the scale of the problem. And the SDG progress report was released in April. It's quite sobering. We're on track for 12% of the SDGs. 50% progress is weak or insufficient. And for 30%, the gaps are actually getting greater. So the SDGs are very powerful to say, the urgency is increasing and we need to get more money in there. And maybe to finish on a more positive note, I really want to commend AIIB for their Sustainable Development Bond framework and the impact reporting. I think it's exactly what my work with institutional investors has shown, that investors really care about impact. They want to see where their money is going. And if you're an asset manager, pension fund, an insurance company, it really helps to explain to your end customer, this is what I'm doing. AIIB's impact report is incredibly detailed. So I think that's a great innovation for the market, and I hope that other issuers, not just MDBs, but corporates and sovereigns follow suit. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jitin. And if I were to just sum up what you just said, right? You are bullish about Asia, and in terms of just the issuers and also others who are wanting to invest in this. I think that it's rather looking very positive, right? And that's coming really off the back of COVID, etc., in pretty tough environment. But you made a very important point that the climate or SDGs, they're all interconnected. So particularly in developing nations, I think we want to also have the conversation about what is just transition as well, what's a phased transition. Not only from a climate perspective, but also from a social perspective. Ibu, I did a SDG project before, in Pekanbaru, and trust me, it was so difficult to firstly identify what were the gaps, because we needed to actually understand what was government also helping in and what were the residual white spaces. And then the toughest part of the job was actually measuring impact. And then measuring impact against the specific SDG goals as well, or targets, right, for the particular province. So I tell you, it is not easy to do these kind of projects, and I totally appreciate that. But actually, Ibu Dwi, you also let me know, what do you think about just Asia and where the market is going in Asia in terms of sustainable financing as well and bonds?
I think Anthony and Jitan has a wider view from the market because they play on the market, they are a player. But for me as an issuer, we see that the trend of the market for SDGs bond or SUKO is getting more and more. For example, in terms in Indonesia, we see many SOEs already issue a green bond and ESG bond. For I think last year there are three banks already issue and that instruments. You know why? I think the reasons because issuer as well as the investor needs to diversify their portfolio. See, they have to meet their strategy to have like social and environment impact, and also they have to be responsible on the environment when they do invest, right? This one, for example, when the government start to issue green SUKO and ESG SUKO and ESG bond and blue bond, there will open the gateway to other issuer to issue and increase the awareness from the investor, and also give a chance to investor to fulfill their portfolio needs. For SDGs impact, I also actually can show you the experience of Indonesia for SUKO. We note many goals that can be reached from green SUKO. First, goals number 4, for example, for quality educations. We already finance many projects and to support education facilities such as university, schools, laboratories. I think we can give a number 1,110 since 2015 till now. So I think it's about, is it 8 years? We already built many schools, facilities. And then for goals number 6, clean water and sanitations. Green SUKO also built many what we call to support drinking water supply for peoples. Also, now it's about 180,000 household connections for water supply. And then goals number 7, clean energy access. SUKO also finance renewable energy projects. I think that one is play a vital role in ensuring clean and affordable energy access for all Indonesians. And goal number 8, design work economic growth. I think we have a lot of projects to be funded by SUKO, generate economic opportunities, create jobs, and stimulate local business, thereby fostering inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And of course, we also have goal number 13, climate action. Of course, for Green SUKO, we support mitigation, adaptation activities, and to reduce the impact of climate change. I think a lot of goals can be achieved through issuing SUKO, for example, because the difference between SUKO and bonds in Indonesia, that for SUKO issuance, we can utilize directly to finance the projects. So it's here for us to achieve the SDGs.
Thanks very much, Ibu. So I think what I'm hearing from you and whatever you just said, SDG 4, 13, clean water and sanitation, actually these are all based on the SDGs targets, right? Exactly the issues in Indonesia, exactly those issues. So really, impacting directly, the SDGs that matter most. So thanks so much for sharing this. But you are talking about the impact that you're making, right? And now if I can just segue into, and we talked a little bit about the difficulty of measuring impact, and it matters because the SDGs themselves, and Jitin mentioned this, we are actually halfway through the SDGs. And the SDG targets, they're very specific, right? For example, for SDG number 4, you have specifics about how many, young people of a certain age must have, a certain type of education level, right? So I want to just segue into impact and how do you measure impact as well. And maybe I could ask my esteemed panelists, Dom, Jitin, and then Dwi, because you, I think, have direct experience in this. Tell me a little bit more about how do you do that? What's the methodology that you use? What are the matrices? And can I also ask, perhaps in the future, we can see a world where we have one single methodology for impact and be able to have it consistent and comparable as well across the world. So maybe Dom, and then maybe later to Jitin, what are your views on this? And it's so important, accountability, right? Accountability, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, Yulin, and we probably come to the hardest part here of the discussion. I think it's fair to say that when it comes to climate finance, measuring impact is a thorny issue. As you said, it's not easy to do. There is even no agreement how to do it in many instances. So first of all, I want to start by making a distinction. When you look at climate finance, of course, the first distinction you have to make is between mitigation and adaptation. And this is becoming common lexicon in climate finance. So while it can be, but it's not assured, but it can be easy to agree on how you measure the impact. For example, we come here to Egypt, we just step outside, there's a desert in front of us. We write a check of $100 million, we cover it with solar panel. I think most likely we are generating a mitigation impact, which is easy to measure, how you produce clean energy and all the data that come in terms of GHG reduction and so forth. So that's less contentious. But even there, I would argue that it's not easy. A few days ago, back in headquarters in Beijing, we hosted Greenpeace. And they came with a very interesting presentation, and we had a very interesting discussion about how you are going to dispose and recycle, hopefully, all the implant for renewable energy that we also, including us, MDBs, we are actively busy financing. So they explained that between 2025, which is very close, and 2035, they talked about the staggering amount of photovoltaic panels and wind turbines that will need replacing because they will exhaust their life cycle. And personally, I was not well aware with the enormous complications from a technical standpoint associated to that, how you recycle some of the rare earth materials which are employed making those, how complicated it is to disentangle because of all the glues and the resins, highly chemical factors that are used, how you dispose of the wind turbines blades. We could talk until for a couple of hours about that, so very complicated. However, even having said that, I will say that it is less contentious how you go about measuring mitigation. When it comes to adaptation, more complicated. Again, we could, for example, finance a healthcare facility in a rural community in the highlands in a region to provide better access to healthcare to a rural community. But it's a flood-prone area, for example. So the same project in a better area would cost 30% less, 40% less You build it up there in some rural community, up in a mountain, make it flood resistant, slide resistant, cost a lot more. So that's the piece you have to measure if you don't want to double count what you're doing for climate finance. So how you do that, here I want to say that perhaps our community, the IFIs, the multilateral development banks, were advanced, or we do have a common understanding and common agreement, because there are some principles here. And this goes back to 2015, when the MDBs agreed some common principles on how you track adaptation finance. And then out of those principles in 2020, between 2020 and 2021, the MDBs agreed on how to measure. So you can make sure that same project, if the Asian Development Bank finances, or AIIB finances, or the World Bank finances, it's measured in the same way. And I think that's what can give us some optimism, that we at least have some common understanding how to go about with this very complex issue of how to measure impact. Again, as I said, you could think that just installing a wind turbine farm is a good thing, but then if you don't worry what happens after the 15 or 20, 25 years of operation, you need to take care of that part of the impact. So it's a very complicated issue.
Understand. Thanks so much, Domenico. Jitin, did you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Domenico. We agree that impact is key, measuring, monitoring, and reporting against it. The JP Morgan Development Finance Institution, maybe as a little plug, was actually set up on the premise that with impact, you have a further dimension to attract capital from investors into sustainable development. We saw a demand from our clients in emerging markets, so sovereigns and corporates, who had good ESG stories to tell to the market, but there was no harmonized way. And we also saw a lot of institutional investors who were running ESG strategies. Now we're looking more and more at impact, ex ante, and outcomes. So we worked with the DFIs, specifically the IFC. We used their anticipated impact measurement and monitoring framework. And we adopted the DFIs, because they're the experts on impact, to be honest, adopted their methodology, which is available on our website as well. And we've used it now for 40 of our issuer clients, including the Sovereign of Egypt, for example. And they have issued in total about 24 billion of bonds and loans. So we actually have within these standard vanilla deals an impact disclosure section. And I mentioned this, but maybe I should have started with saying why impact is important, especially for emerging market issuers. In our experience, ESG ratings and some of the regulations that Antoine mentioned at the beginning, like the European Union Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, they often use developed corporates in developed markets as their baselines. So it's quite difficult sometimes for Asian sovereigns or corporates to fare well in terms of ESG ratings, or in terms of the provision of data that an investor who's running, say, an Article 8 or 9 strategy would need to comply with that. And there has been encouraging signs in Asia in terms of more and more issuers are adopting the Science-Based Target Initiative. But what we've noticed at the JPM DFI is the real trend for investors is the trajectory of these issuers. So not so much what is your ESG score now, but how are you trying to address that? What are the steps that you're taking to improve it? What is your impact, not just on the operations of the company, but the community and the broader region through your business? And impact, if we drill into it a bit more, has become more and more of a standalone designation. So according to the Global Impact Investor Network, $1.2 trillion now of assets under management is pure play impact, which if you compare that to the 35 trillion I mentioned earlier, is a significant portion. And to your question on standardization, so Antoine mentioned this at the beginning, like reporting impact is difficult, the regulations, there are many that are coming out and there's lots of different requirements. So we're actually part of an impact task force, impact disclosure task force. We're working with creating entity-level guidelines. So we're working with DFIs, investors, underwriters, standard setters, and rating agencies, so that if you're a corporate in emerging markets or developed markets, or a sovereign, you'll have guidelines to measure your positive impact, so alignment to the SDGs, and also your negative impact, so do no significant harm, and in the European Union lexicograph, it's the principal adverse indicators. The second core objective of this task force is to establish a platform for issuers to upload their impact data, because it's very good having guidelines, but ultimately if you're an investor, you want some easy place to access the data. And the third is to develop the ecosystem around impact. So you saw this with green bonds, but you need second-party verification agents. You need entities that could do the ratings, so you could have an impact rating or an impact intensity rating. And then also, hopefully one day you would have benchmarks against impact, so not just a green or ESG benchmark. And the ultimate goal with respect to our work in impact with the other institutions is to create like a virtuous circle. So if you're a sovereign or a corporate that discloses, monitors and reports against impact, you will elevate your ESG profile and therefore attract a more sustainable finance.
Thanks so much, Jitin. And Ibu Dwi, anything from your side, from your impact perspective?
Yeah, I think I would like to add a little bit about the impact from our experience. Yes, of course, we have to convince the investor how we use our proceeds for green sukuk by providing the impact. And the impact should consist of the one by one project should be measured how how they can contribute to lowering the emission, and then also the impact of social and also an economic. But to do that, we have to have a standard to be followed. In our case, we follow ICMA, which is provide guidance on sector-specific guidance and reporting metrics recommendations. One thing that we have done to provide the prudent and also transparent and accountable for the report, we need support from our partners. In this case, we have a good partner from World Bank who has experience, and also they have a standard for the reporting. Also, we have a partner with UNDP who already work with all ministries, line ministries who manage all the projects, because the project is not managed by the MOF as issuer, but managed by the line ministries. So by doing that, we believe that we can convince and globally accepted by investor for our report.
Thanks so much, my fellow panelists, for answering the impact question. So, I may summarize, right? I think, to apply consistently, I think there are frameworks around there. For example, Domenico mentioned about, the MDBs, having, a consistent framework. But sometimes, stakeholders who want to know more information, and that's why Jitin says, we can layer it on with some more information around stewardship. And also, Ibu Dwi, you mentioned that actually it is difficult, but find partners along the way. You mentioned about UNDP, some from the World Bank, that can help you to articulate this a bit better. So I think very, very useful, thoughts about that. And I think this space is still developing, but, all in the right direction. I have one last question, actually, before I open it up to the floor, right? And this is really about, we talked about this yesterday during day one. And I think, many of the ministers said this as well, is how do we get private sector to be more involved in this, what is it that the governments can employ to engage with private sectors? What is the secret sauce to get them sticky, right? The private sector sticky in sustainable infrastructure projects as well. What kind of incentivization can we have? And maybe I'll go with Jitin, Domenico, and then to Antoine. Jitin, yours very quickly. Yeah.
Sure, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep this fairly punchy. So when I speak to my infrastructure colleagues, there's not necessarily a concern on the supply of capital for investment, but rather from the lack of bankable projects. There's a lot of project implementation hurdles that were touched upon yesterday as well in the key panel. So some solutions I think governments and private sector can explore. One, scaling up the very effective public sector initiatives. Two I want to speak about. One is the Global Infrastructure Facility, which was launched in 2014, and for every $1 that's gone in, $100 of mobilization has been produced. That would need increased support from donor countries and governments. The second on the same theme is AIIB's Bayfront securitization platform that was launched in 2021. That was mentioned yesterday by the President. That gives investors a really easy way to access infra assets. And Bayfront actually did another tranche last week, I think, for $400 million. So scaling up those initiatives, I think, is very important. Second would be project capital. So developers of greenfield projects, there's a couple that come to mind, climate fund managers and allied climate partners. These take early equity stakes. And I think the idea there is that they should sell those and then recycle. So more capital in that early development area would be good. Another idea would be something to do with human capital. So potentially we could set up a project development academy and get instructors from academia, DFIs in the private sector, and offer skills and the courses that give skills for people to go back to their countries and translate their national targets into actual tangible projects. And the last one, and this was talked about yesterday, but de-risking the areas that the private sector find most difficult. So local currency for infra projects that don't have FX revenue streams, providing longer tenor capital, and also helping with the legal frameworks. But I'll keep it to that given time.
Okay, thank you. Domenico, just really quickly, and then to Antoine. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, very quickly, Yulin, I would just say that in order to involve more private sector, we should empower the MDBs to take more risk, a lot more risk. And this is the way for the MDBs to pave the way for private capital to come into the projects where we want to go. I have to say that at the moment, I don't see this. There's not a super conducive environment. If you look at the way, we don't have any regulators, but for example, we really answer to the rating agencies. And of course, in order to preserve our AAA rating, which is vital for us, however, you know, what this is doing, this is basically driving the MDBs to act more and more like commercial banks. And so avoid lower credit countries, highly risky projects, and look at them through the lens that a commercial financial entity would look at. And I don't think that's our mission. We should be in the sectors where, you know, we can deploy money with very high tolerance to risk and to losses in those sectors where we have to be according to our missions. We don't have to be reckless, of course, no speculation or others, but there are some sectors that really need capital to go in. And the commercial, the financial investors won't do it. We have to get them involved.
Any perfect solution to this at this point in time, to take more risk?
In the works? I don't have one, but for example, one of the things that some MDBs have done, for example, they have established some kind of almost like a venture capital small shop within the MDB, for example, So that's the people that look at the more contentious deals and the things that where you can look with really the edge of the financial markets and the private equity companies, for example, and work together with them. That could be a solution to empower that and become bigger, put more capital in there. So these kind of things.
Got it. Good point. And Antoine.
Yeah, I will comment on the sustainability part of the question. Definitely is another angle. We need MDBs to be active. MDBs has been a leader to develop sustainable finance. I mean, they created in Europe with EIB and then IBRD and all the other developed significantly in the market. We need them to set up the standard in the environmental and social risk management system. They are leaders. In the impact measurement, they are leaders. And as Ibudui shared, when you tap a market, you pave the way for others to enter, and then you can capitalize the good practices and the momentum around sustainable finance.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Look, I've got a little bit of time left, and I thought maybe I'll open it up to this room to ask any questions, if any. You guys look as if you're raring to go to ask questions of this esteemed panel. So over to you, anybody. If not, I've got a few. Oh, over there, the gentleman just in the middle of the room, please. And yes. Oh, and the lady, please. Yes.
My name is Edward Coffey. I'm from Liberia. I work for the Mountain River Group. I like the way Domenico put it. They just want to make it simple, easier for everybody to move through it. But from a strategic standpoint, maybe we should take it a little further. And by furthering it, we should look at simplicity from the lender standpoint and from the creditor standpoints. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if you consider how it works from the creditor side, well, you float your bonds, they get sold, people acquire them, and then you distribute the money to those who want to borrow from you. Then from the creditor's standpoint, he gets to work, he has a guy on his shoulder, you got to pay my money. And he says, well, I mean, the project is not, yes, infrastructure, it's not going to be complete until 2 years. Oh, no, you said you're going to pay. And so this is why some of the NDBs are thinking about local currency. US dollar is dominant across the world, so especially for the bigger economies, yes, you can get it. You have so many investors who can put your money in that. But in the smaller countries like Liberia, where the equity market is not well developed, sometimes, and from the standpoint of what the other MDBs are thinking, that maybe we should open it up a little bit to give people a little breathing space. And in my mind, I think that's strategic. I just want to know what you think about that, because I think Jitin was talking about something like that, maybe.
Thanks so much,
well,
sir.
not in my view, though, but his view.
Thanks so much, sir. Maybe I can also gather questions. So the lady in sky blue top. Just collect.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very interesting panel. So I'm Petra Shell-Wright. I work for a civil society organization called Recourse, and we've been monitoring the AIIB for some time. I wanted to very much agree with Domenico. Is that correct? Yes, sorry. Your point about AIIB being different, it's an MDB, and it can fund in a different way, it should think in a different way. And to me, as a Swede living in the UK, it's also taxpayer money, so for me it's quite important that it's invested in the right way. I just had two questions. We're very interested in seeing how AIIB is developing in this area in terms of sustainable development bonds. One of the concerns we always have as civil society, though, is around transparency. How do we know that the money that gets invested actually ends up in the right place and that it's not harming communities? So that's one question. How do we know? What's the transparency regarding the bonds? How can we trace the financing. The second one was related to fossil fuel particularly. I've just seen the International Energy Agency have just released its new report. It's again calling for no fossil fuels in the future. They've upped the alarm bell, and on gas in particular. And we know both in the Climate Action Plan of the AIIB and the Paris Alignment Methodology and the Energy Sector Strategy that fossil fuel is still allowed. Coal is out, and we're very grateful for that. That's a really great step forward, but gas is still in there. So how do I know as well that when we talk about sustainable development bonds with these loopholes in policies, that it doesn't go towards fossil fuels still? So that was my second part of the question. But thank you again for an interesting panel.
Thanks so much, both. I think the last point was a bit of a point from Antoine about what we consider green or sustainable, so the taxonomies and definitions within certain countries. But I open it up to the panel, to answer those couple of questions. I think the first question, was a little bit more, how do you make it more strategic, right, nuanced? And the second one was about looking into more about what are not only about the right type of energy sources, but also social as well. Ben?
Yes, thanks, Jolene. Maybe I just start and then I give it to my colleagues. First, I wanted to go to the interesting point that you made on the tracking, I guess, talking about tracking of proceeds. And that's an important issue that all investors and all observers and the civil society are interested. And this is the reason why we put together the impact report at the bank. So if you look at that, for example, we provide data, we break down all the projects of the bank, which is all the money that we deploy against the SDGs. And those SDGs that are relevant to the bank's mission. And so there you find the information, how the money is flowing into the projects that we are financing. So that's a super important issue that we decided to even elevate as a legal principle. So that language about sustainability and use of proceeds is enshrined also in the legal documentation for our bond issuance, in the use of proceeds. So we don't use a kind of a general purpose, but we say that all the money that we raise through every bond will be deployed against sustainable financing as detailed you will find in the impact report. This is also gives me also the chance to address another comment that you also touched upon, and also the gentleman, in terms of the simplicity concept. And I think simplicity is a central issue if we really want to make sustainable financing grow. And I'll give you an example, and you have to excuse me because I think about these things more from a financial angle, because I'm a treasurer and I work in capital markets. I'm not a sustainability expert, but as we have to grow this sector, I think we should become more interested on how we address our message as a sustainable issuer to say, okay, this particular issuer, you are doing something good for the planet, and this one issuer or company, you are harming the planet. And then how we convince the PIMCOs of the world, Antoine's friends at Amundi, Fidelity, the large investors on the planet, how to say, okay, if you are in sustainability and you're providing climate finance, you will pay less for your capital, and if you are polluting the planet, you will pay more for your capital. For me, it all breaks down to that, and that's the real issue. How we do that, rather than, for example, engaging with investors to convince them that my next $50 million equivalent private placement ticks each and every box on the definitions for sustainability. I'm not saying that is not important. I'm not saying that we want to do that, but our mission should be how we convince the large capital to get into this type of cause and provide a more accessible finance to the entities that are involved in sustainability.
Anyone else before I wrap up? Or?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just a bit conscious
If
of
I
time.
may just add a little bit with your question and at the answer from Domenico about how the investor can track the proceed and that make sure your money will invest in the right way, right? As I mentioned before that before we issue green sukuk, we have to provide or build what we call green framework. And that consists of 4 pillars. Pillar 2 mentioned that we have to have how to select the project from the very beginning, so we can measure how much impact of the project itself. So we also make any single projects and we measure the impact. Okay, and the pillar 3, management of proceeds. It means that we have to manage the proceeds, and it should be anyone can trace where the money goes. It should go to all the projects selected. That's and to make sure and convince the investor, our report should be audited. So the auditor will see for the on behalf of the investor, of course, the auditor will see how it works, whether the issuer work in the right way, comply with the framework or not. So the framework itself, actually, the guidance for the investor to see and track the money go to the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just a bit conscious of time, and I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'll probably just wrap it up right now. So what I've heard from the panelists is that there is definitely a place for MDBs, such as the AIIB, to play in terms of sustainable bonds and for sustainable development, particularly also for developing nations as well. And there is demand out there, what Jitin said, there is demand in Asia. Or what Ibu Dwi said as well, the millennials, they are also looking at this very closely as well, into, for example, the sukuks, the green sukuks. And, but we're not, it's not, maybe we can start with simplicity, but there are also some things which are a little bit more complicated. What our one of the audience said, what is green, what's not? The taxonomies amongst nations also really matter, and the interoperability amongst that as well. Jitin's point about, climate, but let's not forget social as well, and that's coming up through the SDG objectives that Indonesia has. And impact measurement, yes, difficult to do, but heading in the right direction in terms of consistency and in terms of capacity, capability as well. And for the private sector question, maybe, for them to come in a little bit more, MDBs perhaps can take a little bit more risk, and also maybe have some kind of mechanisms like VC types of platforms and initiatives to take more risk as well within themselves. So I'm going to end off right now, but I just want to have one sentence, right? Just one sentence from all my panelists here about what you want to leave the audience with. So maybe I can ask Jitin, just one sentence, real quick.
Okay, so more bankable projects and more importance on impact and disclosure.
Okay, very good. More bankable projects, more impact on disclosure.
I will just borrow, perhaps, Yulin, if you allow me, a sentence that has been used by United Nations Secretary General Gutierrez just a few days ago as he opened the assembly in New York. Really resonated with me. Maybe I'm from a Latino Catholic background, I don't know, but he said, on climate, humanity is opening the gates of hell. That's what he said. And if we believe in that phrase, I think again we have to go back to the issue of simplicity and volumes. That's what we need on climate finance.
Got it, got it. Thank you, Domenico. Over to you, one sentence.
Okay, for me, I think the important thing is for collaboration and partnership.
Collaboration and partnership.
Why? Because for sustainable financings, we need a lot of fund, of course, and how we can mobilize the fund from the markets, and also we have to find the right partners to solve these problems together.
Collaboration and partnership. Antoine.
After honeymoon is coming the first dispute.
Sorry, say that again?
After the honeymoon, it's coming the first dispute.
Okay, got it. Okay. On that note, I'd like to thank you so much for your...
So it's just a sentence to express the fact that there is a big momentum around sustainable finance these days. Everyone is agree. Everyone is more or less aligned. Everyone is committed to carbon neutrality to 2050 or 60, 70, depends on the countries. But that is only the beginning of the story. That's the easiest part of the story. That was already difficult to achieve, but the easiest. When I mention dispute is because in the next 10 or 15 years, we have certainly to face some difficult discussion, difficult situations. Some players will not move fast enough relative to the objectives we all agree. And the marginal cost of reducing GHG emissions, I mean, for the first ton is probably manageable. For the last is certainly definitely more expensive. So that's the idea of my sentence. Don't forget that the main challenges are still coming, even if everyone agree with the principles for the actions.
Thank you to my panelists, for sharing a little bit more about their one-liners on sustainable financing and infrastructure development. And on that note, I want to thank my panelists and also, those who are attending here and elsewhere, for attending this session as well. So thank you very much and have a lovely day. Thank you very much. Take care.